Joining me today is Mickey Huff. Let's agree to disagree, a critical thinking guide to communication, conflict management, and critical media literacy. It's so common that it's become a cliche. Americans gather around a holiday table with sumptuous food and plenty of drink. The best china has been taken out of storage for the occasion. Family from out of town reunite after a long year apart or only seeing each other on Zoom. It all starts out with such good intentions and high hopes. Then the talk turns to politics. And in short order, cousins are screaming at each other. Siblings are vowing never to speak again. Parents are pounding the table. Someone is crying while others are being excommunicated, and another holiday has gone awry. Mickey Huff and co author Nolan Higdon offer advice on how to have productive discussions, cultivating effective communication rather than emphasizing our differences. Uh, Huff is the executive producer and co host of the weekly syndicated public affairs program, The Project Censored Show. Welcome to the show, Mickey. Nice to have you on.
Catherine, it's a delight to be here with you, and it's always an important subject. Even though we just got over another contentious election season, there is an air of divisiveness still about us, and it's certainly something that the media likes to stoke.
That, yeah, and I think that's an understatement. We've been doing that at least for the past 10 years, and I guess we're going to continue to do that, right? The media does stoke the conflict, and you're here to tell us that it is really critical, not just in families, as I read in the intro, but it's really, and I think you obviously mentioned this in the book, it's critical for our democracy to be able to talk to one another, to not put, and so all of that ability to do that really does begin in the family.
It really does. And, sociologically, over the last several decades, we've seen shifts and changes in family structures, and certainly some of that has been positive in terms of uh, movements towards acceptance of different kinds of families, non-traditional quote unquote families, which are always again political and sociological constructions in any society. And in the United States, we go back 50 years. Nolan Higdon and I are both historians as well. Um, Society, it may have appeared to have been maybe more cohesive and so forth in many ways, but that's also because there was a lot more imposition, sort of a more authoritarian way that families were defined. And so as we got out of the 1960s and 70s, a lot of those traditions and um, a lot of those things that we've associated with what family is, really were challenged and changed. And I want to stress that there's a lot of good reasons for that. But at the flip side of it, sociologically and politically, we also have documented extraordinary ongoing separateness or divisiveness. And what Nolan and I talk about in some of our publications, including Let's Agree to Disagree, but the book we did prior to that was called United States of Distraction. And the subtitle is Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America and What We Can Do About It. And it looks at sort of a collapse, not only of what we defined or how we saw family, but the political economy of that structure and how it became harder and harder for Americans to economically survive or politically find sort of their way through the wilderness of the 70s and the 80s of the Reagan years. And what we've seen as we get into the 21st century is we have increasingly siloed ourselves in terms of education, in terms of our media habits, production and consumption. And it's just really contributed to many people sort of feel overwhelmed and lost in the din or the noise of the media and political cultural apparatus in this country. And what Nolan and I have tried to do as both historians, journalists, and people that teach critical thinking is try to remind us that look, things may feel like they're quote worse or more divisive than ever, but historically that's always a relative point. It's always a relative question. And we started the Let's Agree to Disagree book, by the way, with a quote from none other than Eldridge Cleaver. That name might not mean much to people today or to younger people today, but if you remember, Cleaver was in the Folsom State Prison in California, a writer and an activist for the Black Panther Party. And a quote from him, which I find very fascinating, given that this is from the 60s, He says the destiny of the entire human race depends on what's going on in America today. Well, does that sound familiar, Catherine?
It
Um,
definitely does. Yes, it does. It sounds very familiar. And I do know Eldridge Cleaver.
oh,
I'm a baby
naturally,
boom. Well, yeah,
I certainly assumed that you did, and I know
yeah.
many of your listeners might. Um, but what the thing too that Nolan and I discovered teaching history is that a lot of the folks that we have coming through our college classrooms are um, they're relatively unaware of the more recent past. A lot of the ways in which history is taught in this country kind of goes up to World War II or Vietnam, and then you know, we've run out of time in yet another year to talk about what happened after the Carter and Reagan years. Um, and what we find is that like that history is really instrumental in trying to understand what challenges we face as a society that have been caused by sort of the corporate capture or privatizing nature of our educational system, and also the increased conglomeration of our so-called town square, our public media systems, most of which, right, are not actually public. They're hyper commercialized, they're private, and they're for profit. And we have about half a dozen or so major corporations controlling what people refer to as mainstream media, which really it doesn't represent mainstream views if you take a look at the polls. And the other is we have about five tech companies now that are controlling a lot of that town square online. And so Nolan and I argue that the more people are aware of what's going on in those systems and those structures, and historically, the more people are aware of how we got where we are today, right? Like
Yeah.
one
And
of
Mickey, I want to ask you the question. I know you teach at Ithaca College, so you are connected to a lot of college students,
Mhm.
obviously. But what about in terms of being aware? Yes, we have to be aware of what's going on and how we get our news and but how do we trust? I'm thinking I had a discussion this morning with someone who was talking about the fact that who do we trust? How do we know that what we're hearing is accurate, even if it is out there, even if it is available, the truth or the facts are available, but how, well, that's the question. How do we know what's real and what's not? And
Well, Catherine, that's
yeah,
that's that's the $1 million question, I guess. Adjusted for inflation, it's $1 billion question now. You're exactly right. And that's actually what led that very question is what led Nolan and I to write the Let's Agree to Disagree book that came out in 2022 on Routledge. We've adapted some of that into another publication with several people in a book called The Media and Me, which is a critical media literacy book for young people, because the answer to that question is in the subtitle of that book, Critical Media Literacy, teaching media literacy education to young people, not waiting until they're maybe college age, if they even go to college at all. But we have to model critical thinking. We have to model what it looks like to ask critical questions. We have to also help people understand what biases are, what are cognitive biases, what are implicit biases, what are informal logical fallacies. And these aren't just concepts that are, just deigned to be discussed in ivy towers. These are things that we need as citizens of a purportedly free society if we're able to communicate with one another, get our ideas communicated clearly, and understand each other. And also, back to the underpinning, I think, sort of point of your question, the way that you develop trust is through inquiry and persistence. And if you take a look at a lot of polls, Pew polls over time, not just snapshots, but a history over the last many years, we see declining trust in the American public among almost all public institutions, whether it's the media or Congress, or the Supreme Court, the presidency, local government. We're in a sort of a civil crisis in many ways that's connected to a collapse of public education and really a collapse of that public square that's been facilitated by a more cravenly self-interested conglomerate of media corporations that basically pitched to caged audiences, Team Red, Team Blue. Ethics rarely seems to come into the question in terms of the Society of Professional Journalists and the way that the news is reported. And consequently, over the years, Catherine, if you take a look, we go back to quote Lao Tzu, if you do not change direction, you may end up where you're heading. Well, we've been heading here for quite a while. And what Nolan and I try to point out in several ways is that we need to diversify media habits, not just go to our confirmation biases. We need to learn empathetic listening. We need to learn active listening skills. We need to move ourselves outside of our bubbles and our comfort zones in a way that helps us understand that we live in a really diverse culture, a really diverse society, and that diversity uh, can be a real core strength that makes us, sort of who we are as a society, rather than being a point of constant dissension and divisiveness that, well, let's be honest, both corporate America and the major political parties sort of utilize that as a tool for their own ends, whether it's to gather more eyeballs for advertisers or to gather more votes or support in the polls for particular policies. But curiously, Kathryn, what we see is that if you ask Americans basic questions that aren't based on sort of cultural divisiveness, when you ask Americans about economic issues or you ask Americans about healthcare issues, we have a majority of people that want affordable access to healthcare. We have a majority of people that want access to education. We have a majority of people that want the United States to spend less money on the Pentagon. I mean, these are things that have been documented over and over again, but yet our political culture doesn't respond to those issues. And as Nolan and I argue in several of our works, the reason for that is that institutionally, these bodies have been basically co-opted. They've been populated by people that have other interests that fly in the face of what the public wants, which has actively contributed to further decaying trust in those institutions. And we kind of have a catch-22. And that's why we keep going back to education and we keep going back to trying to provide tools for people to help them understand how to think more critically. We're not in the business of telling people what to think, right? And that's a key distinction we make because,
Yeah, and I'm going to stop you there because
yeah,
how do
please.
we do that? I mean, you've listed, we're talking about diversity. When do you start? Where do you start? As you say, you don't start when people go to college or graduate school, or many people don't get that far anyway. So when do we start and how do we do it?
Well, you mentioned something earlier, Kathryn, that I think we can't avoid. And it does have to start in the home. It has to start in people's communities when they're very young, because that's where a lot of this kind of conditioning takes place. And as we've seen shifts in family, and we've seen maybe a quote breakup of some of the elements of family where people are more working or out of the home. We've certainly seen outsourcing of how our youth then might be raised or what they have access to. A lot of kids, are raised on media or different kind of media representations. A lot of what we see more and more in the early grades of school is moving away from literacy, and for the last couple of decades, it was gearing people to take tests. Well, what we've seen again from pedagogues and other scholars of education is that that's been exactly the wrong direction. That is not filling the gaps that we need to be filling in young people when it comes to understanding the diversity of our society or understanding how our government or how our civil culture actually functions, not the ABC, schoolhouse rock version from the 1970s about the bill on the hill, right? We need to teach people about political economy as much as we need to teach them about empathetic listening. We need to teach them STEM topics, but we also need to teach MESH, which is media literacy, ethics, sociology, and history. This is again why we're going back to education. There's a huge role for education to play here. But like I said, we've seen it go in a direction in the last couple of decades that moves away from critical examination. It is more fearful in its approach because there's so many different pressures coming in on our institutions and society about grooming and what we're supposed to be teaching people. Half the states, Kathryn, have laws now trying to meddle in sort of the accurate teaching of American history. And more beleaguered teachers are worried for their jobs that if they try to teach something that they know is important and accurate but is controversial, they may shy away from it. And that again, I think is an unfortunate approach. I'm almost tempted to say it's the wrong approach, although I don't want to sound too reductionist in that capacity. But I can tell you that it's not getting us where we need to be as a society of empathetic citizens that are civically engaged in meaningful ways that can communicate different ideas effectively and
So
come
what's
to
the
some
difference
kinds of
between
compromises about where
what's
we
the
need to
difference,
be.
Mickey, between blue states, and I'm going to use the word versus, blue states versus red states in terms of what we've been talking about, what you've been talking about, curriculum, education, the ability to be able to teach the kinds of things that you're talking about? Because I think there's a real difference.
Oh,
And yeah,
you're correct. Yeah, I'm sorry to say that you're
yeah.
you're right. But the interesting thing is, and I want to mention this blue state, red state, team blue, team red thing again. Just because we call something a red state doesn't mean that 48% of people don't lean another way. Just because we call something a red state doesn't mean that those people don't care about education or don't care about certain issues. This is again a negative consequence of sort of the nationalization of the political sphere to turn it into like a game, a horse race or a sporting event. And we have this zero sum, all or nothing legislative approach where both major parties, although I would argue Republicans more than Democrats, they seem to be, despite even some of their more recent divisions within MAGA and so forth in Silicon Valley, Republican states tend to sort of, move aside some differences and they focus on things and they tend to polarize. They tend to go for more extreme positions and views in somewhat might be part due to the fact that the Republicans have actually been a minority party. And I know that that might not resonate with people given the outcome of the last presidential election, but when you take a look at, the history of registered voters in the last generation or two, Republicans have been a minority party. And many of their ideas have been not just discredited, but they've become, believe it or not, less popular. That's why the GOP has really been working to co-opt populist rhetoric. They've been working to try to appeal to sort of red meat cultural issues to get people to come out and vote. And the Democrats really have not really done as good of a job at motivating their base to give people something to vote for. And part of the outcome of that, part of what happens is that we have more exaggerated sense of this divisiveness. I'm not saying we don't have differences, but the way in which media and the political apparatus frame these divisions is that they're insurmountable and everywhere. And what Nolan and I find when we travel around the country or when we talk to many people like you and others is that a lot of people actually do care about similar things. They just don't always have um, the wherewithal or the experience of, again, how do I communicate my idea in a way that doesn't come across as a truth stick, but sounds like, amusing or something that I've been thinking about? How do I listen to people empathetically and ask if I understand correctly before I just dive in and start telling them they're wrong?
So what you're
Again, our
saying is
media
they
system
don't
doesn't.
have the tools. They know they have an awareness. They are
Yes.
not, yes, but they don't really have the tools to be able to express themselves in a productive way or in the way that you're talking about, asking questions, being empathetic, because we haven't been taught, I guess is the
We don't
word.
have models that really
We
do
don't
this.
have models.
I mean, and this is what we do in the classroom, and this is what we try to have people do out of the classroom. And, we lead seminars and public talks where we openly talk about things that we even, that even we won't agree with. In the book, in Let's Agree to Disagree, we purposely went and grabbed examples that would ruffle the feathers of our so-called Team Blue or Team Red folks, but in a way that actually leads people into a more purple or a grayish area, if you will, where people can learn to build bridges, not walls. Rather than start with the things we disagree about, push pause divisiveness. How did we get to this impasse? What are other things that we could talk about where we have common ground? How can we set achievable goals for a communication? Like, we live in an instant gratification culture where we think we have to solve all the problems immediately. And if in the first 20 seconds of a discussion things go awry, people are already hitting the eject button. But this is what we're talking about in the book when we talk about agreeing to disagree. It doesn't mean just walking your own way. It doesn't mean allowing yourself to be abused or to be a doormat. It means that you want to really make an earnest effort to understand how somebody else has arrived at a viewpoint that they do, the degree to which they want to passionately espouse it, and try to understand it. And we may not be able to understand certain ideas, but if we make efforts, if we validate people's feelings, even if we don't agree with them, we do create possible inroads to discussing why we may think that what someone else is expressing is inaccurate or is harmful, right? And it's very difficult to stay calm in these kinds of conversations. It's hard to remember to de-escalate than rather than to escalate and want to try to control the situation. But if we practice these things with each other, what we can notice is that we can develop relationships with people where we never thought we might be able to carry on longer than a 2-minute conversation. Dare we say some of these relationships can become lifelong, as in the case of Daryl Davis that we talk about in the book, the African American activist and jazz musician who went out and persuaded hundreds of people who were Ku Klux Klan masters to give up their hoods and to, over time, change their positions and become non-racist. I mean, that's a pretty extraordinary thing not only to seek to do, but if Daryl Davis, as an African American, can go and convince white supremacists that their ways are wrong, then why can't I do similar things in my circles? And why can't I reach out to people in my communities to try to understand what they're thinking and also help them understand maybe why the things that they're doing are misguided, misinformed, not in a way that we use the wrong word again, that word I used earlier, but in a way that gives them opportunities to grow and change. And our educational system, our media system, and our political system is very unforgiving of that growth and that change.
We have to personalize it. That's what you're saying about the jazz musician. He's out there, he's interacting, he's part of their context, the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like, what's your problem with me, man?
yeah, right, exactly. And when you start to do that, everything changes. Uh, what about, as I understand it, in this past election, 80 million people who are eligible to vote didn't vote. What does
Yeah.
that say?
Wow. What does it say? I ask my students that often in classes. We talk about how many people vote and who got how many votes and who quote unquote won the vote. You take a look at some of our more recent elections, and it's the people that didn't vote that won. Um, well, I mean, that's a funny way of looking at it. Um, but that's creating the impression that there is some huge mandate for the outcomes of any of these recent elections, which is just factually inaccurate. It's just not true. Um, it's another way that we bolster the red blue, kind of edifice of the political system without actually looking into, how did things go? And why, by the way, are people not voting? The biggest indicator in that is that people don't come out to vote if there's nothing to vote for. And a lot of people that end up that do vote are voting against the other person. A lot of Democrats weren't wild about the Kamala Harris campaign, but they're manically opposed to, Orange Man bad, right?
Yeah.
So that's the big motivator is to let's get out and vote against Trump. But that's not really a great sustainable way to build political movements over generations. I mean, is it important to oppose authoritarian sounding policies and campaigns? Absolutely. But the way to do that is by offering an alternative that is significant enough that people will come out and vote. And as I mentioned, there are key areas where the American public are in a majority that Democrats could have harnessed and chose not to. And so we are at an impasse. And how then do we reach those 80 million people that didn't turn out to vote and convince them that their voices are needed and they're needed to help create new and different paths forward in our political culture so that we don't keep repeating over and over and over like Groundhog Day the outcomes of these elections?
We only have 3 minutes left. So obviously there's lots more to talk about and lots more to talk about in terms of your book when we want people to get out there and buy the book. So Mickey, tell us, where can we get the book? Tell us about you, your work, what platforms we can go to for more information about all of that.
Well, thanks, Kathryn. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation, which again, I see as another opportunity to model how we can talk about these kinds of things. The piece that you were referring earlier is called The Revolution Starts at the Table, that's available at theedgemedia.org. That's kind of a synopsis of our book. The Edge is part of the Park Center for Independent Media, where I'm the director at Ithaca College, where I teach journalism. But for the previous 20 some years, I've taught at Diablo Valley College, where I teach social science, history, journalism, and social justice studies. So I have a lot of experience in the classroom, and I also direct the nonprofit Project Censored. You can learn more at projectcensored.org, where we teach critical media literacy and we showcase the work of independent journalists and how they cover things that the corporate media either don't or won't, or if they do, they don't cover it in a deep enough way that reflects the complexities of the issue. And we think that the more people diversify their media habits rather than go to Team Red or Team Blue media, the more they have opportunities to think more critically and differently about the things happening in society, and the more avenues they may have to bridge differences between people and take down walls that are built up through our media structures. So projectcensored.org is a great place for people to learn more about what we do. We've got a lot of free resources for educators on media literacy. And that's really, again, Kathryn, what our prime objective is. We really want to try to help people teach and learn about critical media literacy and conflict management, and how to be better communicators, more empathetic communicators, and also how to be sort of more confident in how we verify the veracity of information based on our own critical thinking skills, sort of not outsourcing it to so-called fact checkers.
Mickey, thanks so much for being on the show today, Mickey Huff, because we've learned a lot. And as you say, there's a lot more to learn. And you've given us that opportunity. The book, again, is Let's Agree to Disagree, a critical thinking guide to communication, conflict management, and critical media literacy.
Thanks so much for having me, Kathryn. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
Joining me today is Gail Lukasilk, author of What They Never Told Us: True Stories of Family Secrets and Hidden Identities Revealed. Blending social history and personal narratives, Gail Lukasilk delves into the devastating psychological trauma of uncovering a hidden family secret with all the twists and turns of a mystery novel, starting with how the discovery was made, to why it was kept secret, to the arduous, sometimes disappointing quest to find a biological parent or parents. To fully understand the secrecy surrounding these family secrets, her book examines pre-World War II and post-World War II attitudes towards infertility, adoption, donor conception, race and racial passing, and unmarried pregnant women. Prefacing these harrowing narratives is the author's own confusing and sometimes painful journey to redefine her racial identity under the spotlight of public opinion. She is a contributor at the Washington Post and has also appeared on PBS Genealogy Roadshow, BBC World News, and NBC's Megyn Kelly Today. Welcome to the show, Gail. Nice to have you on.
Thank you, Kathryn, and I appreciate your having me on the show.
Family secrets. Obviously, you have had your own family secret and then decided to find out, I guess, or delve into other people's family secrets, what they are and who they are and how it all comes about. I mean, you're telling these stories of people's family secrets and their hidden identities and the repercussions of that. Let's start with that. Like it's and I say, I don't know if I mentioned this in the intro, but and I don't think I did, but now that we have access to our DNA, that's changed everything in terms of revealing some of these secrets that we never did have access to before these tests that we can take.
That is correct. I'll start with a statistic because I think it's surprising. It was for me when I was doing my research. In 2019, approximately 26 million Americans had taken a DNA test. Now, since 2019, if it went at the same rate, it's estimated that it will exceed 100 million. And of those 100 million people, it's estimated that 4 in 10, or 38%, will have an unexpected familial result, which means they will find out that either one or both their parents are not their biological parent. And what really inspired me to do this book occurred after my book, White Like Her, My Family Story of Race and Racial Passing, was published. And then I appeared, as you mentioned, on the Megyn Kelly Today show. And after that, I don't think I'm exaggerating, I received an avalanche of emails through my website from strangers, not just in the US, but across the world, wanting to tell me their family secret. Now, I'm a stranger, but somehow my revealing my own secret inspired them to contact me. So I still get the occasional email, though the book came out 7 years ago. I'm still getting people contacting me. But at the time that I'm speaking of, there were a lot. So I thought, maybe my next book, I should tell other people's family secrets and not just mine. So that was the impetus for What They Never Told Us.
Let's can we talk about some of those stories?
Yes.
Yeah. And maybe why you chose the ones that you did for the book.
Well, part of that, let me give you an example of one or two first, and then I'll explain why. One of the things that two people in the book, well, actually more than two, discovered when they did the DNA test was not only was one or both parents not their parents, but they were not the race they thought they were, which, that can be kind of surprising.
Yeah, surprise, right?
I thought I was, and now I'm not.
Yeah.
An example of this is Bruce Paul Scott. He was raised in a very large Irish Catholic family. And he felt like he didn't look like anyone else in the family, his siblings. He had 9 siblings. They were all blue-eyed and fair-skinned. And he, on the other hand, had very dark curly hair, dark brown eyes, and he tanned easily. And growing up, when he went to school, he was taunted by his classmates about his appearance. And at some point, it turned really nasty, and people started calling him the N-word. So when he told his father about this, the way his father explained it to him was, you have a recessive gene. That's why you look the way you do. So this sort of dogged him in his entire life into adulthood, his not looking like his family. So after his parents were deceased, he did take a DNA test in 2014. And guess what? He discovered he was 37% African, which meant the father who raised him was not his biological father. So he did go in search of his biological father. He used an organization called DNA Angels. And if anyone's wanting to trace a biological parent through DNA, this is the place to go. Now, he had a rather long search. I think it was 6 years. And he did find who his biological father was, but he was deceased. And he was a Black man, a laborer with a, I don't know, 4th grade education, living in Texas. At the time, his family was in Texas. So this left Bruce with a very unsettling question. How did his mother, a white woman with 3 children at the time of his conception, become involved with a Black laborer? And you have to remember, he was conceived in the 1950s. So we're talking 1950s Texas, when an interracial sexual relationship was a crime. So he didn't stop his search there. He wanted to find more about the paternal side of his family, and he ended up finding a half-sister. So they shared the same father. And now they have a close relationship. But he told me that he really struggles with the fact that his parents never told him the truth once he had become an adult. He accepts that he's biracial, but psychologically, psychically, he's still not there, and he has real identity issues going forward. And the way he deals with this is that he tries to help others and to be an example for someone else who might discover something like this. So I think he's an excellent example of someone getting a shocking DNA surprise.
Don't you think it would seem to me anyway, and everybody has a different story to tell, it's shocking no matter what, and perhaps you can't really understand those feelings until you actually do it. It's really scary, because it seems, as you say, his parents were deceased. He kind of always knew there was something different, but it sounds like, you push it. I don't want to really deal with that, and didn't until I don't know how old he was when he actually did this, but decided to find his biological, take the DNA test to begin with. But like, because I think maybe this is just a myth too. Many people think, oh, once I find out where I really came from, all will be well, because then I'm going to know the truth. And the impact on the person who's doing it, but also on the impact on, well, he has this half sister who may, you say they're very close now, who may have not wanted to have anything to do with him.
Well, she had gone on Ancestry as well, so she had also done a DNA. But when she actually contacted him, because as you know, once you take the test, you can make that public, your results. So she found him, but she didn't understand how centimorgans work, so she thought he was a 3rd cousin. And actually, they share enough DNA to be half siblings. So he had explained that to her, and when he did, he called her and told her, she started crying because she said, you mean my dad's not my dad? So it was very disturbing to her. And she though had a Black mother, so she never had any question about her race. That's a little bit different. But I think if we look at trauma, I'll tell you another story that's in the book, which is actually the opposite of Bruce's story. It's Kara Rubenstein-Dayerin, and she grew up believing she was biracial, Black father, white mother. And she was fierce about defending her biracial identity. At school, she suffered racial slurs. At one time, a classmate said, "Are you biracial?" And she said, "I am." And the girl slapped her in the face. So again, she took a DNA test, but her thought was, oh, my dad and I, my Black father and I are going to take this DNA test, and then we're going to go trace our roots back to Africa. Okay, so she takes the test. And yeah, she's half white, but she's not half Black. She has no African heritage. She is half Ashkenazi Jew.
Wow.
So and this gets even more interesting. She does trace her biological father, who ends up, he's deceased, but he ends up being, he was a very wealthy man in Seattle. He was known as the Salmon King of Seattle. And she does connect with family, but because she's telling the story now to me, she said, because there was so much money involved, they rejected me. So they didn't want anything to do with her. They thought she was after the money. She said, I was looking for medical history. So, and Cara is an interesting person. Because of her discovery, she ends up founding and is the CEO of Right to Know. And you can Google that. And that means right to know your genetic identity. And if anyone's finding out something they didn't expect, I would go to her site as well, because she has all these resources. But Cara also, once she found out she was half Jewish, she really embraced that side of herself. And so that's her story.
That's her story. And those are, as you say, kind of, they are diametrically opposed in terms of what their expectations were, what, and for finding their biological roots. So what are some of the other issues? And I actually was going to ask you that question. I think a lot of, or people that I know, that is a question, like, if the biological parent or parents are very wealthy, are you coming to get our money or prestige, all of those kinds of things? And as you say, in this case, it was just not just, but it was, she wanted her medical history. So, yeah. So what are some of the other reasons, obviously, besides the overall, I want to, find out where I came from, because there have to be perhaps other motivations or other things that your stories that individuals found that surprises.
Well, just think about it for yourself. Let's find out, you find out your father's not your father, and maybe, your biological parent is a different race, maybe not. It just, depends. The way we understand identity, we want to understand our whole identity. We don't want to just understand part of it. So everyone that I interviewed in the book told me they went on the search for the biological parent because it was not only reconstructing and redefining their identities, but was part of healing. And you can't heal until you know your whole self. And the other element that comes into play here, I have a section on adoption. And I have a story about Brad Ewell, who's a Texas cop who doesn't find out until he's 48 that he's been adopted. We want to know our biological parent because it's called genetic mirroring. We want to find out someone that we look like. When a baby's born, what do? What's the first thing we do when we see the baby? Oh, the baby has your eyes, has grandmother's hair, or, that's part of the becoming, I call it the tribe, bonding with your tribe. So in many of these cases, people said to me, I never look like anyone in the family. One woman told me, I was so desperate to find similarities, physical similarities, that I was looking at my grandmother's thumb. And I thought, okay, our thumbs are the same. This is part of the search, and this is how we put ourselves back together.
What if you find out?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm thinking about that your biological father is really your mother's lover, the next door neighbor, is your father, your biological father. Your mother had an affair. That's a whole other
Right.
issue. Yeah. So,
I
yeah.
can tell you a real short
All
story
right,
about
tell us a
that.
short one about, yeah.
It's actually how I end the book. The last
Oh,
chapter
okay. Yeah.
I call Strangers Keep Telling Me Their Secrets.
Yeah.
I was at a conference in 2023, actually hosted by Cara, and it was the first time that there's been a conference that united people who were adopted, who are donor conceived, who find these parental surprises. We all came together for a weekend. And as an author, I was on a panel and I was selling books. Of course, you sit at an author table, and this woman came up the first day and she said, I just found out that my father was not my biological father. But she was very, very tough lady. And she said, but I can handle this. You know what I did? I know who this guy is. He lives right in town. So I marched over to his door. I knocked on his door and I told him I was his daughter. And you know what he said to me? I want you to leave right now and don't ever come back. So she said, I'm probably not going to stay for the conference. I just wanted to meet you. So I looked at her and I said, I didn't even know her name. I said, you might want to just stick around for some of the panels, might be helpful. So the next day, I'm at my table again, signing books, as authors do.
Yeah.
And I see her in line. So she waits till everyone's gone and she comes up to me and she said, I thought I could handle this, but I can't.
Mm.
And then she started to sob. And I held her hand. There was really not much I could say to her. I just held her hand and afterwards I said, look, here's my card. If you need to contact me, please do. I'd love to hear from you. I never heard from her, but she thought she could handle it. She really couldn't.
Couldn't.
It was so, it was not just the finding out, it was the rejection.
Mm-hmm. What about other therapists, social workers, psychologists who actually specialize in therapy and counseling for those who are either thinking about seeking their biological parent or parents, or have done it and they're, it's a trauma, it's a loss, it's all kinds of things.
Yeah, there's one story in there, it's Josephine's story. She actually is a psychotherapist. And when she found out, again, the father who raised her was not her biological father. And she decided that she was going to specialize in this area of these discoveries. And she told me, she said, when I started to tell my therapist about it, there was no protocol. There was nothing. She said she really couldn't help me very much. So that's why she decided to specialize in this. And I have resources, by the way, at the back of the book for people who are interested. And I gave some information on that. So yeah, I don't think we've caught up with the science yet in terms of how do we treat people who have these discoveries. It's a different kind of trauma. I'm not an expert, though. I'm not going to say I am because I'm not. I just know what was told to me in the research I did.
Well, you talk about, and I think I read this in the when I did read the intro, pre-World War II and post-World War II, our attitudes towards infertility and adoption and race and racial passing and unmarried pregnant women, that affects our expectations and how we respond, right, to finding our biology. Yeah. So
yeah, totally. You really can't look at this from 21st century eyes. You have to think this is mid 20th century. What was going on then? And a lot of these secrets were kept. The reason the parents kept them was because of shame. There's a lot of shame around the secrets. As you mentioned, if mid 20th century, if you were a pregnant, unmarried Woman, a lot of shame there. You were encouraged very strongly to relinquish the baby and to get on with your life. And in cases of adoption, why it's so difficult when these adults find out they're adopted, so many of these records are still sealed. Part of the reason they sealed the records is because of the fear that the child would find out they were a bastard. And back in the, mid 20th century,
Yeah.
that's not a good thing. So social mores is what we're talking about,
Yeah.
religious ideas about how we look at this. We don't look at it the same way.
Absolutely. I think we've done a 180. Many women want to have a baby, choose to have a
Yes.
baby without having a partner or a husband or a wife. Yeah. So it is very different.
Yeah, and I think the lifting of that shame is a good thing.
Yeah.
I really do. But the problem for the parents who keep the secrets, it's very difficult for them to let go of that shame. It's so embedded in them. It's how they were raised. It's what, they were told. It's how they were treated. So I'm not saying they can't. I'm just saying it might be difficult. So I don't, in the book, as you know, I don't throw any parents under the bus. I have great empathy for them and total understanding of what they were going through.
Yeah. So there's no judgment.
No, I don't do that.
Yeah. And well, your own story, maybe just tell us briefly.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. In 1995, we're going back now. I was between teaching jobs, and I decided I was going to do some research on my maternal grandfather, who has a very interesting name of Azimah Frederick, and he's from New Orleans. My mother, born and raised in New Orleans. So back then, there's no ancestry, very little internet. So I went to the local family history center and started searching through census records, found Azimah in 1900 Louisiana census. He was like 2 or 3. And all the Fredericks had a B after their name. And when I went to what column that was, it said race. I had no idea. I asked the woman who was running the center, I'm assuming that means black. Does that mean black? She said, oh, yes, it does. And then she let loose with all these racial slurs, which I stood there and what is going on here? She kept referring to a type of candy.
Oh.
It was, I'm not going to say the word.
Yeah.
And candy.
Mm-hmm.
And then she ends up by saying, oh, you're the one with all the slaves in your family. So that was my first introduction to a secret I had no idea about. Long story short, it ends up being true that my mother was passing for white. When I looked at the 1940 census, she was still, her and her sister were still designated as Negro in Louisiana. I ended up going on PBS's Genealogy Roadshow, and they confirmed everything I thought was true. The sad part for me of this story is that when I did end up confronting my mother about her secret, at first she denied it. Then I told her I'd get her all the documents, and she said, you can never tell anyone about this till after I die, because how will I hold my head up with my friends? That really got to me. It made me so sad for her. I really felt sadness she lived 17 more years, and the only people I told, my husband, my 2 children, and a very close friend, and that was it. I kept her secret. And I tried to talk to her about it during those long 17 years because I thought, I'm trustworthy. She wouldn't even let me tell my brother, my only sibling. And so I tried to bring it up, and every time I did, she would say something like, so how are the kids?
Total denial.
She wouldn't talk to me about it.
We only have 2 minutes left. This is quite a story, because I was going to ask you, there has to be an upside to that too.
Yes, I found her lost family.
Yeah.
That's the
well, it's really, I've really enjoyed talking to you in this, but what they never told us. We want people to go out and get the book and give us platforms we can go to get more information about your work and your books and what you're doing, your work, I guess, what you're doing now.
Thank you, Kathryn.
Yeah. Gail still with us?
Yes.
Yeah. Just give us a website.
It's my name.
Yep.
Gail Lukasilk, LUKASIK.com. And my books are, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, any bookseller. But yeah, you can just Google What They Never Told Us or White
Great.
Like Her.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Gail. It was
Thank
really
you, Kathryn.
yeah, it was a pleasure talking to you.